Hey solo gamers, thanks for checking out How's It Play Solo. I'm Mac Kern, and today I'm going to take a look at Fields of Arle. This is a farming themed worker placement game for 1 to 2 players. I'm going to give an overview of the game and then I'm going to talk about the solo variant. Let's check it out. As you can see, Fields of Arle is a pretty huge game. This is my best attempt to cram a 1-player setup into one shot. If you were playing with 2 players, you would have a second home board and a second storage board. This is the main board where all of the worker placement happens, and up top is it's sort of like a resources storage board. And I'm going to go over each board in detail to show the purpose that board serves in the game. So the main board is broken down into 2 sections. You have a section with buildings, which I'll go over in a minute, and you also have the action part of the board. So all of the available actions are listed here, and these are broken down into summer and winter actions. So the game takes place over 9 half years. You have 5 summers and 4 winters. Once per half year, 1 player is allowed to take an action from the other side of the board. So if I am the start player in summer, on the very first turn, if I want to take a winter action, I'm allowed to do that. But if I do, then no one else is allowed to take a winter action for the rest of the summer. And that also has an effect on player order. You have these nifty markers to mark start player. Normally, if 1 player is the start player in the summer, then the other player gets to be start player in the winter. But if the player who was supposed to be start player in the winter during the summer takes a winter action, then they forfeit their right to be the start player in the next season. The worker placement aspect of this game will feel pretty familiar to anyone that has played a lot of worker placement games. 2 things that stuck out to me. One is that you can't add any more workers to your pool. You start out with 4 workers, and you have 4 workers for the duration of the game. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that a lot of these actions that are available are dependent on tools. So kind of straddling the 2 seasons, you have all these different tools, and you're able to make them more powerful, which in turn makes the corresponding actions more powerful. So if I take the Master Workbench action, that allows me to increase the value of my tools. So the workbench is one of my tools, and for every workbench that I have, I can increase the value of another tool. And you're actually allowed to, if I increase the value of my workbench, then I can use the new value. So also, anytime you see this blue and white border, that's a cost that's required to carry out the action. So if I want to increase the value of my Master Workbench, I have to pay 2 clay to do so. And then because I have 3 workbenches now, that counts as 1 increase. I can increase 2 other tools. So maybe I'll pay 1 wood to increase the value of my axes. Maybe I'll pay 1 brick to increase the value of my ovens. And then later in the game, when I take actions that are dependent on those tools, they're more powerful. So if I take the woodcutter action, instead of getting 3 wood like I would at the beginning of the game, I get 4. Another really interesting thing about this game is that there's less blocking than there is in the typical worker placement, because in each season there's 1 action that allows you to imitate, and that lets you choose any other action of the current season that someone has already performed and perform that action again. So even if you have taken that action, maybe you take the builder action to build something, and then you want to build something else, you can just use the laborer to pay 2 food and imitate that building action to perform it again. So the vast number of actions that are already available, combined with the ability to imitate actions, really just opens up the board and prevents strategic blocking. The buildings are the main source of variety in the game. Some buildings will appear every time, but most buildings are randomly chosen before the start of the game. And there's 2 main types of buildings. You have just a couple of buildings that provide you with anytime actions, so they have a little clock on them. And once you've paid the appropriate resources and built this building, you have actions that are available to you at any point in time without using a worker. So for example, if I build the carpenter's workshop, at any point in time, I can spend a brick and 4 food to convert a stall to a stable. But a lot of other buildings in the game provide you with immediate benefits. So the smokehouse immediately lets me cut 1 peat for every fish trap that I have. Or the smithy would allow me to convert my boats and carts to plows. And these also provide points at the end of the game. The home board is used to represent your own farm, as well as your resources and also how much traveling you've performed over the course of the game. So anytime I build something, anytime I build a building, it's going to go on my home board. This is also where I store my animals. I have fields. This is the setup for the start of the game. So you start out with a grain field, you start out with a flax field. You have these marshes, they're called the moors, I believe, and this one starts out with peat on it. Through actions on the main board, you're able to flip these over, and when you do so, you actually place more peat on these spaces, and that peat can be harvested. You have to harvest peat to heat your home in the winter. I'll talk about that later. You can have 3 types of animals. You start out with a horse, but there's also sheep and cows in the game. You start out with a stall, which can hold 3 animals. The animal storage rules are pretty lax in this game. So an empty space can hold 2 animals of the same type. You also have these dikes, which you can move over the course of the game. 1 dike can hold 1 animal as well. There's an action on the main board that allows you to move these dikes up, and when you do that, you gain access to more spaces on your board, and you can even move those up farther every time you create a new opening to the next row. You have even more spaces to utilize on your board. Also, I mentioned the peat on these fields. Once you harvest all of the peat on one space, you get to remove that from the board, and so that gives you another space to place things. Also, you can avoid negative points at the end of the game by getting rid of those tiles. The way that these resources are represented is pretty cool, and there's a lot of resources in the game. One of the main resources is food, and you have 2 food markers because you can actually have up to 30 units of food. The rest of these resources, you have wool, you have flax, hides, grain. You max out at 15 of those resources. And at the end of the game, if I have 7 wool, that's worth 1 point. If I had 15 wool, that is worth 3 points at the end of the game. The storage board is kind of like your personal barn. You can use this area to store vehicles. You can also store plows and peat boats. Peat boats allow you to, after you have built them for the cost of 1 wood, you can use peat as any of the depicted resources. Also, you'll notice a lot of tiles have this flip icon. There are actions on the main board that allow you to flip tiles. And so, for example, you could flip a peat boat to turn it into a plow. You can also gain a plow by building it through actions on the main board. But those peat boats and plows are stored on your storage board. One of the most important parts about the storage board is that you can build and store vehicles there. And there's a couple different kinds of vehicles that all have a different resource cost and are worth a different amount of points at the end of the game. But once you have these in place, you can use them for a couple different purposes. One of which is to convert your resources. So a lot of resources have kind of an unrefined type and a more valuable refined type. So wood is easily attainable, whereas timber is rarer and more valuable. I can convert wood to timber with my vehicle. And the way I do that is when it's my turn, during a half year, I can place that resource into one of my carts, and I don't get to unload it until the end of the half year, but when I unload it, I have the more valuable version of the resource. So you can do that with wood to timber. You can convert clay to brick, although it costs you 1 peat to do so. You can convert leather to saddlery, and so that just increases the amount of points that it's worth if you hang on to it till the end of the game. And also, sometimes a building cost or the resource cost for an action on the board will require you to have the more valuable version of the resource. Another really important thing you can do with vehicles is travel. So you have all of these locations at the top of your storage board at the beginning of the game. And traveling works in a similar way to converting resources. I can do this at any point during my turn. It doesn't cost me an action or a worker to do so, but I can travel. If I want to travel to this city, I put it in my cart, and it has to fit in my cart as well. So, for example, this city is too big to travel to, but if I had the larger cart, then it would fit and I could travel there. So when I travel to a city, I have a couple options. You gain food immediately based on the goods that that city is willing to buy. So I could sell any 2 animals for 9 food, and I get that 9 food immediately. I can use it right away, but this city stays in my cart until the end of the half year when I unload my carts. At that point in time, it's going to go to the travel section of my home board. And so the more you travel, the more points you gain at the end of the game for travel experience. But when you travel to a city, you're not limited to choosing one of the benefits. I could sell them saddlery and leather to get a combined 42 food, which, as I mentioned earlier, your food maxes out at 30, so that wouldn't be a wise choice. But I could also remove one of my moors entirely from the board. So there's a lot of cool benefits that come with the traveling. It's a good way to get food quickly. Food's a very important resource. And also, the more you travel, the more points you score at the end of the game. The storage board also contains reminders for the actions that you have to perform at the end of the summer and winter seasons. So now's a good time to go over those. At the end of every summer, I receive food in accordance with animals that I have on my board. So if I have 2 sheep, that's worth 1 food. If I have 3 cows, that's worth 2 food. Also, every grain field that I have provides me with 1 grain. Every flax field provides me with a flax. If I've built any forests on my board, they provide me with wood. And after I've gathered all those resources, I'm required to pay 3 food to feed my family. If I don't have the food, I can pay either grain to make up for each missing food, or if I don't have grain, I can sacrifice an animal for each missing food. And then also, because winter is coming, I have to pay 2 peat to heat my home for the winter. But if I don't have the peat, I'm allowed to spend wood instead. And for every unit of food or peat or the substitute resources that you're missing, you have to record 1 supply bottleneck, which takes away points at the end of the game. At the end of every winter, your animals reproduce. Only your animals that are located indoors will reproduce, and only if the building that they're located in can accommodate another animal of that type. But in general, if you follow those guidelines, you get 1 offspring from 2 animals. And after that, you get wool from your sheep. So if you have 1 sheep, you only get 1 wool, whereas 4 sheep will give you 2 wool, and so on. You don't have to worry about heating your home in the end of the winter season, but you do still have to pay that 3 food. At the end of the game, pretty much everything is worth points. You get points for things that you've built on your farm. You get points according to how much you traveled. You get points for the vehicles in your storage area. You get points based on leftover resources, goods that you created. You get points for how much you increased your tools on the main board. You get points for different types of animals. And so everything is worth points. You're just trying to score as many points as you can. There's only a few ways to lose points. Of course, if you failed to feed your family or heat your home over the course of the game, you lose some points. If you don't clear off all of these moors Even on the flip side, they're still worth negative points. If you don't move your dikes to the top of the board, you can lose a couple points. If you don't have any large vehicles, you can lose points from that as well. But in general, it's a pretty forgiving game, and the way that everything provides you points really allows you to create strategies that specialize in one area rather than having to be a jack of all trades. To play Fields of Arle as a one-player game, the only change you make is that at no point in time are you allowed to take an action from the opposite season. Other than that, all of the rules are exactly the same, and you're simply trying to score as many points as you can. I normally say that I don't love beat your own high score type games, but if you've watched a lot of my other videos, you know that there's a handful of games of that type that I do enjoy. Fields of Arle is one of those games, and part of that is that it doesn't feel that much different without an opponent's interference. There's not that much your opponents can do to disrupt your plans in this game because it's such an open game and there's so many actions available at one time. I can completely focus on my strategy, my opponent could completely focus on their strategy, and there's just not a whole lot of mean interaction going on. So when you play it as a one-player game, you still have that big open feel. There's still a world of possibilities. And my satisfaction with Fields of Arle doesn't necessarily come from playing better than my opponent. I just like to pick a strategy at the beginning of the game and see how well I can carry it out. Because a big part of the game is that it's completely deterministic after the setup. Once you see the buildings that are included in the game, everything else is already laid out in front of you. And so it's a lot of fun to pick a strategy and see how well you can stick with it. There's not a lot to get in the way of your plans. There's not a whole lot of external requirements. You have to feed your family. It's beneficial to accumulate some animals and build up your engine along the way, but you're pretty much free to do whatever you want. And I think that makes it a great game for anyone that enjoys open sandbox environments. A lot of people might have concerns about the replayability of the game because it's so low on the randomness spectrum, but I think that the available buildings and the way that those are randomly selected before the game, I think that provides a lot of replayability, and there are so many actions, there are just so many strategies to explore that I think that Fields of Arle will definitely not wear its welcome out anytime soon. A lot of people also mention that it's pretty heavy. I don't really see it as a heavy game. It's a little long. It has a lot of depth to it. There's a lot of possible actions. But once you learn the rules, there's not a lot of referencing the rulebook or anything like that. It flows pretty well, especially if you've played a Rosenberg game before. There's a lot of familiar concepts, and I just think that Fields of Arle is really the cream of the crop. Check it out.